making firm plans how to put you on the Amerlin seat once we reach Tarvallen. His tone was guarded. Very likely he still was not entirely sure what was going on or how far he could trust Mirella, and it took her a moment to realize what he had done. It made her breath catch. Maybe she was just becoming too used to the way Aes Sedai shaded words, but Bryn had just said the army was hers. She was sure of it. Not the Hall's, and not Shiriam's. Hers. Thank you, Lord Bryn. That seemed little enough, especially when his careful nod, his eyes steady on hers, seemed to confirm her belief. Suddenly she had 1,000 more questions, most of which she could not ask, even were they alone. A pity she could not take him into her confidence completely. Caution until you're sure, and then a little more caution. An old saying that applied very well to any dealings that brushed against Aes Sedai. And even the best men would talk things over with their friends, perhaps especially when things were supposed to be secret. I'm sure you have 1,000 details to see to, what's left of the morning, she said, gathering her reins. You go on back. We will ride a little more. Bryn protested, of course. He almost sounded like a warder, talking of the impossibility of watching every way at once and how an arrow in the back could kill an Aes Sedai as quickly as it could anyone else. The next man who told her that, she decided, was going to pay for it. 3 Aes Sedai were surely the equal of 300 men. In the end, for all his grumbles and grimaces, he had no choice but to obey. Donning his helmet, he started his horse down the uneven slope toward the merchant train, instead of back the way they had come, but that was even better from her point of view. Will you lead the way, Swan? She said when he was a dozen strides below. Swan glared after him as though he had been badgering her the whole time. With a snort, she tugged her straw hat straight, wheeled her mare around, well, dragged her around, and heeled the stout animal to a walk. Egwene motioned Mirella to follow. Like Bryn, the woman had no choice. At first, Mirella directed sidelong glances at her, plainly expecting her to bring up the sisters sent to the White Tower, plainly gathering excuses for why they had to be kept secret even from the Hall. The longer Egwene rode in silence, the more uneasily the other shifted in her saddle. Mirella began wetting her lips, fine cracks spreading in that Aes Sedai calm. A very useful tool, silence. For a time, the only sounds were their horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a bird in the brush, but as Swan's direction became clear, angling a little west from the path back to the camp, Mirella's shifting increased until she might have been sitting on nettles. Maybe there was something to those bits and pieces Swan had gathered, after all. When Swan took another turn westward between 2 misshapen hills that bent toward each other, Mirella drew rein. There is a waterfall in that direction, she said, pointing east. Not very large, even before the drought, but quite pretty even now. Swan stopped too, looking back with a small smile. What could Mirella be hiding? Egwene was curious. Glancing at the green sister, she gave a start at a single bead of perspiration on the woman's forehead, glistening in the shadow just at the edge of her wide gray hat. She most certainly wanted to know what could shake an Aes Sedai enough to make her sweat. I think Swan's Way will offer even more interesting sights, don't you? Egwene said, turning Daishar, and Mirella seemed to fold in on herself. Come along. You know everything, don't you? Mirella muttered unsteadily as they rode between the leaning hills. More than one drop of sweat decorated her face now. She was shaken to the core. Everything. How could you... Suddenly she jerked upright in her saddle, staring at Swan's back. Her! Swan's been your creature from the beginning. She sounded almost indignant. How could we have been so blind? But I still don't understand. We were so circumspect. If you want to keep something hidden, Swan said contemptuously over her shoulder, don't try to buy coin peppers this far south. What in the world were coin peppers? And what were they talking about? Mirella shuddered. It was a measure of how upset she was that Swan's tone brought no quick snap to put the other woman in her place. Instead, she licked her lips as though they were suddenly very dry. Mother, you have to understand why I did it. Why we did it. The frantic edge to her voice was fit for confronting half the Forsaken, and her and her shift. Not just because Moiraine asked, not just because she was my friend. I hate letting them die. I hate it. The bargain we make is hard on us sometimes, but harder on them. You must understand. You must. Just when Egwene thought she was about to reveal everything, Swan halted her round mare again and faced them. Egwene could have slapped her. "It might go easier with you, Mirella, if you lead the rest of the way," she said coldly, disgustedly in fact. "Cooperation might mean mitigation. A little." "Yes," Mirella nodded, hands working incessantly on the reins. "Yes, of course." She looked on the point of tears as she took the lead. Swan, falling in behind, appeared relieved for just an instant. Egwene thought she herself was going to burst. What bargain? With whom? Letting who die? And who was we? Shiriam and the others? But Mirella would have heard, and exposing her own ignorance hardly seemed advisable at this point. An ignorant woman who keeps her mouth shut will be thought wise, the saying went. And there was another. Keeping the first secret always means keeping 10 more. There was nothing for it but to follow, holding everything in. Swan was going to get a talking to, though. The woman was not supposed to be keeping secrets from her. Grinding her teeth, Egwene tried to appear patient, unconcerned, wise. Almost back to the road the camp was on, a few miles to the west, Mirella led the way up a low, flat-topped hill covered with pine and leatherleaf. 2 huge oaks kept anything else from growing in the wide depression on the crown. Beneath thick, intertwined branches stood 3 peaked tents of patched canvas and a picket line of horses, with a cart nearby, and 5 tall war horses, each carefully picketed away from the others. Nisao Dachan, in a simply cut bronze-colored riding dress, waited under the awning in front of one of the tents, as if to welcome guests, with Saren Huygen at her side in the olive-green coat so many of the Gaidin wore. A bald-headed stump of a man with a thick black beard, Nisao's warder still stood taller than she. A few paces away, 2 of Mirella's 3 Gaidin warily watched them descend into the hollow. Croy Macon, slender and yellow-haired, and Newell Dromond, dark and bulky, with a beard that left his upper lip bare. No one looked surprised in the least. Obviously, one of the warders had been keeping guard and given warning. Nothing in sight warranted all the secrecy, though, or Mirella's lip-licking. For that matter, if Nisao waited in welcome, why did her hands keep stroking her divided skirts? She looked as if she would rather face Elida while shielded. 2 women, peering around a corner of one of the tents, ducked back hurriedly, but not before Egwene recognized them. Nicola and Arena. Suddenly she felt very uneasy. What had Swan brought her to? Swan showed no nervousness at all as she dismounted. "Bring him out, Mirella. Now." She was getting her own back with a vengeance. Her tone made a file seem smooth. "It's too late for hiding." Mirella barely managed a frown at being addressed so, and it appeared an effort. Visibly pulling herself together, she jerked her hat from her head and climbed down without a word, glided to one of the tents and vanished inside. Nisao's already big eyes followed her, growing wider by the moment. She seemed frozen to the spot. No one but Swan was near enough to overhear. "Why did you break in?" Egwene demanded softly as she got down. "I'm sure she was about to confess, whatever it is, and I still don't have a clue. Coin peppers?" "Very popular in Shinar and Malkir," Swan said just as quietly. "I only heard that after I left Aeldine this morning. I had to make her lead the way. I didn't know it, not exactly. It would hardly have done much good to let her discover that now, would it? I didn't know about Nisao either. I thought they hardly ever spoke to one another." She glanced at the yellow sister and gave her head an irritated shake. A failure to learn something was a failure Swan did not tolerate well in herself. "Unless I've gone blind and stupid, what these 2... Grimacing as though she had a mouthful of something rotten, she spluttered, trying to find a name to fit. Abruptly, she caught Egwene's sleeve. "Here they come. Now you'll see for yourself." Mirella left the tent first, then a man in just boots and breeches, who had to duck low through the door flaps, a bared sword in his hand and scars crisscrossing his lightly furred chest. He was head and shoulders and more taller than her, taller than any of the other warders. His long dark hair, held by a braided leather cord around his temples, was more streaked with gray than when Egwene had seen him last, but there was nothing at all soft in Lan Mandragoran. Pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place, yet it still would not come apart for her. He had been warder to Moiraine, the Aes Sedai who had brought her and Rand and the rest out of the Two Rivers what seemed an age ago. But Moiraine was dead killing Lanfear, and Lan had gone missing in Cairhien right after. Maybe it was all clear to Siuan. To her it was mostly mud. Murmuring something to Lan, Mirella touched his arm. He flinched slightly like a nervous horse, but his hard face never turned from Egwene. Finally, though, he nodded and pivoted on his heel, strode farther away beneath the branches of the oaks. Gripping the sword hilt in both hands above his head, blade slanted down, he rose onto the ball of one booted foot and stood motionless. For a moment, Nisao frowned at him as though she too saw a puzzle. Then her gaze met Mirella's, and together their eyes swept to Egwene. Instead of coming to her, they went to each other, exchanging hasty whispers. At least it was an exchange at first. Then Nisao merely stood there, shaking her head in disbelief or denial. "You dropped me into this," she groaned aloud at last. "I was a blind fool to listen to you." "This should be interesting," Siuan said as they finally turned toward her and Egwene. The twist she gave the word made it sound decidedly unpleasant.
Hope you're doing well.
Mirella and Nisao hurriedly touched hair and dresses as they crossed the short distance, making certain everything was in order. Perhaps they had been caught out. In what? Egwene wondered. But apparently they intended to put the best face they could on matters. "If you will step inside, Mother," Mirella said, gesturing to the nearest tent. Only the slightest tremor in her voice betrayed her cool face. The sweat was gone. Wiped away, of course, but it had not returned. "Thank you, no, daughter." "Some wine punch?" Nisao asked with a smile. Hands clasped at her breast, she looked anxious anyway.
Set this down.
"Siuan, go tell Nicola to bring the punch." Siuan did not move, and Nisao blinked in surprise, her mouth thinning. The smile returned in an instant, though, and she raised her voice a little. "Nicola? Child, bring the punch." "Made with dried blackberries, I fear," she confided to Egwene, "but quite restorative." "I don't want punch," Egwene said curtly. Nicola emerged from behind the tent, yet she showed no sign of running to obey. Instead, she stood staring at the four Aes Sedai, chewing her underlip. Nisao flashed a glare of what could only be called distaste, but said nothing. Another piece of the puzzle snapped into place, and Egwene breathed a trifle easier. "What I want, daughter, what I require, is an explanation." Best face or no, it was a thin veneer. Mirella stretched out a pleading hand. "Mother, Moiraine did not choose me just because we were friends. 2 of my warders belonged first to sisters who died, Avar and Nuo. No other sister has saved more than one in centuries. I only became involved because of his mind," Nisao said hastily. "I have some interest in diseases of the mind, and this must rightly be called one. Mirella practically dragged me into it." Smoothing her skirts, Mirella directed a dark look at the yellow that was returned with interest. "Mother, when a warder's Aes Sedai dies, it is as though he swallows her death and is consumed by it from the inside. "I know that, Mirella," Egwene broke in sharply. Siuan and Lyanna had told her a good bit, though neither knew she had asked because she wanted to know what to expect with Gawain. A poor bargain, Mirella had called it, and perhaps it was. When a sister's warder died, grief enveloped her. She could control it somewhat, sometimes hold it in, but sooner or later it gnawed away out. However well Siuan managed when others were around, she still wept alone many nights for her Alric, killed the day she was deposed. Yet what were even months of tears compared with death itself? The stories were full of warders dying to avenge their Aes Sedai, and indeed it was very often the case. A man who wanted to
Get
die,
on my
a man
game
looking
tomorrow
for
and
what could
actually,
kill him, took risks not
get
even
on
a
my,
warder could
diamond
survive.
art.
Perhaps the most horrible part of it to her was that they knew.
At least I say
Knew
that now.
what their fate would be if their
Once
Aes
tomorrow
Sedai
comes, that'll
died.
be another
Knew
story.
what drove them when she did. Knew nothing they did could change it. She could not imagine the courage required to accept the bargain, knowing. She stepped aside so she could see Lan clearly. He still stood motionless, not even seeming to breathe. Apparently forgetting the tea, Nicola had seated herself cross-legged on the ground to watch him. Arena squatted on her heels at Nicola's side, with her braid pulled over her shoulder, staring even more avidly. Much more avidly, actually, since Nicola sometimes darted furtive glances at Egwene and the others. The rest of the warders made a small cluster,
That's why I haven't been
pretending
getting
to
very good
watch
hits.
him too, while keeping a close
The lid
eye on
wasn't
their Aes
completely
Sedai.
sealed.
A more than warm breeze stirred, ruffling the dead leaves that carpeted the ground, and with shocking suddenness Lan was moving, shifting from stance to stance, blade a whirling blur in his hands, faster and faster till he seemed to sprint from one to the next, yet all as precise as the movements of a clock. She waited for him to stop, or at least slow, but he did not. Faster. Arena's mouth slowly dropped open, eyes going wide with awe, and for that matter, so did Nicola's. They leaned forward, children watching candy set to dry on the kitchen table. Even the other warders really divided their attention between their Aes Sedai and him now, but in contrast to the two women, they watched a lion that might charge any moment. "I see you are working him hard," Egwene said. That was part of the method for saving a warder. Few sisters were willing to make the attempt given the rate of failure and the cost of it to themselves. Keeping him from risks was another, and bonding him again, that was the first step. Without doubt, Mirella had taken care of that little detail. Poor Nynaeve. She might well strangle Mirella when she learned. Then again, she might countenance anything that kept Lan alive. Maybe. For Lan's part, he deserved the worst he received, letting himself be bonded by another woman when he knew Nynaeve was pining for him. She thought she had kept her voice clear, but something of what she felt must have crept through, because Mirella began trying to explain again. "Mother, passing a bond is not that bad. Why, in point of fact, it's no more than a woman deciding who should have her husband if she dies, to see he is in the right hands." Egwene stared at her so hard that she stepped back, almost tripping over her skirts. It was only shock, though. Every time she thought she had heard of the strangest possible custom, another popped up, stranger still. "We aren't all Ebudari, Mirella," Swan said dryly, "and a warder isn't a husband, for most of us." Mirella's head came up defiantly. Some sisters did marry a warder, a handful. Not many married at all. No one inquired too closely, but rumor said she had married all three of hers, which surely violated custom and law,
better.
even in Ebudar. "Not that bad, you say, Mirella? Not that bad?" Swan's scowl matched her tone. She sounded as if she had a vile taste in her mouth. "There is no law against it," Nisal protested. To Egwene, not Swan. "No law against passing a bond." Swan received a frown that should have made her step back and shut her mouth. She was having none of it, though. "That's not the point, is it?" she demanded. "Even if it hasn't been done in, what, 400 years or more? Even if customs have changed, you might have escaped with a few stares and a little censure if all you and Moiraine had done was pass his bond between you. But he wasn't asked, was he? He was given no choice. You might as well have bonded him against his will. In fact, you bloody well did." At last the puzzle came clear for Egwene. She knew she should feel the same disgust as Swan. Aes Sedai put bonding a man against his will on a level with rape. He had as much chance to resist as a farm girl would if a man the size of Lan cornered her in a barn, if 3 men the size of Lan did. Sisters had not always been so particular, though. 1,000 years earlier it would hardly have been remarked, and even today an argument could sometimes be made as to whether a man had actually known what he was agreeing to. Hypocrisy was a fine art among Aes Sedai sometimes, like scheming or keeping secrets. The thing was, she knew he had resisted admitting his love for Nynaeve. Some nonsense about how he was bound to be killed sooner or later, and did not want to leave her a widow. Men always did spout drivel when they thought they were being logical and practical. Would Nynaeve have let him walk away unbonded had she had the chance, whatever he said? Would she herself let Gawain? He had said he would accept, yet if he changed his mind... Nisao's mouth worked, but she could not find the words she wanted. She glared at Swan as though it were all her fault, yet that was nothing alongside the scowl she directed at Mirella. "I should never have listened to you," she growled. "I must have been mad." Somehow Mirella still managed to maintain a smooth face, but she wavered a little, as though her knees had gone weak. "I did not do it for myself, Mother. You must believe that. It was to save him. As soon as he is safe, I will pass him on to Nynaeve the way Moiraine wanted, just as soon as she's..." Egwene flung up a hand, and Mirella stopped as if she had clapped it over her mouth. "You mean to pass his bond to Nynaeve?" Mirella nodded uncertainly, Nisao much more vigorously. Scowling, Swan muttered something about doubling a wrong, making it 3 times as bad. Lan still had not slowed. 2 grasshoppers whirred up from the leaves behind him, and he spun, sword flicking them out of the air without a pause. "Are your efforts succeeding? Is he any better? How long have you had him exactly?" "Only 2 weeks," Mirella replied. "Today is the 20th. Mother, it could require months, and there is no guarantee." "Perhaps it is time to try something different," Egwene said, more to herself than anyone else, more to convince herself than for any other reason. In his circumstances, Lan was hardly an easy present to hand anyone, but bond or no bond, he belonged to Nynaeve more than he ever would to Mirella. When she crossed the hollow to him, though, doubts sprang up strong. He whirled to face her in his dance, sword streaking toward her. Someone gasped as the blade halted abruptly only inches from her head. She was relieved that it had not been her. Brilliant blue eyes regarded her intently from beneath lowered brows, in a face all planes and angles that might have been carved from stone. Lan lowered his sword slowly. Sweat coated him, yet he was not even breathing hard. "So you are the Amyrlin now?" "Mirella told me they had raised one, but not who. It seems you and I have a good deal in common." His smile was as cold as his voice, as cold as his eyes. Egwene stopped herself from adjusting her stole, reminding herself that she was Amyrlin and Aes Sedai. She wanted to embrace Saidar. Until this moment she had not realized exactly how dangerous he was. "Nynaeve is Aes Sedai now too, Lan. She's in need of a good warder." One of the other women made a noise, but Egwene held her gaze on him. "I hope she finds a hero out of legend." He barked a laugh. "She'll need the hero just to face her temper." The laugh convinced her, icy hard as it was. "Nynaeve is in Ebudar, Lan. You know what a dangerous city that is. She is searching for something we need desperately. If the Black Ajah learns of it, they'll kill her to get it. If the Forsaken find out..." She had thought his face bleak before, but the pain that tightened his eyes at Nynaeve's danger confirmed her plan. Nynaeve, not Mirella, had the right. "I am sending you to her, to act as her warder." "Mother," Mirella said urgently behind her. Egwene flung out a hand to silence her. "Nynaeve's safety will be in your hands, Lan."
What?
He did not hesitate, or even glance at Mirella. "It will take at least a month to reach Ebudar. Arena, saddle Mandarb." On the point of turning away, he paused, lifting his free hand as if to touch her stole. "I apologize for ever helping you leave the 2 rivers. You or Nynaeve." Striding away, he vanished into the tent he had come out of earlier, but before he had gone 2 steps, Mirella and Nisao and Swan were all clustered around her. "Mother, you don't understand what you are proposing," Mirella said breathlessly. "You might as well give a child a lighted lantern to play with in a hay barn. I began readying Nynaeve as soon as I felt his bond pass to me. I thought I had time, but she was raised to the shawl in a blink. She isn't ready to handle him, Mother. Not him, not the way he is." With an effort, Egwene made herself be patient. They still did not understand. "Mirella, Even if Nynaeve could not channel a lick, she could not, actually, unless she was angry. That would make no difference, and you know it. Not in whether she can handle him. There's one thing you haven't been able to do. Give him a task so important that he has to stay alive to carry it out. That was the final element. Supposedly it worked better than the rest. To him, Nynaeve's safety is that important. He loves her, Mirella, and she loves him. That explains, Mirella began softly, but Nisao burst out incredulously atop her. Oh, surely not. Not him. She might love him, I suppose, or think she does, but women have been chasing Lan since he was a beardless boy, and catching him for a day or a month. He was quite a beautiful boy, however hard that might be to believe now. Still, he does appear to have his attractions. She glanced sideways at Mirella, who frowned slightly, tiny spots of color blooming in her cheeks. She did not react any further, but that was more than enough. No, Mother. Any woman who thinks she has leashed Lan Mandragoran will find she has collared only air. Egwene sighed in spite of herself. Some sisters believed there was one more part of saving a warder whose bond was broken by death, putting him into the arms, into the bed of a woman. No man could focus on death then, the belief ran. Mirella, it seemed, had taken care of that herself, too. At least she had not actually married him, not if she meant to pass him on. It would be just as well if Nynaeve never found out. Be that as it may, she told Nisao absently. Arena was fastening the girths on Mandarb's saddle with a brisk competence, the tall black stallion standing with head high, but allowing it. Plainly this was not the first time she had been around the animal. Nicola stood close by the thick bole of the farther oak, arms crossed beneath her breasts, staring at Egwene and the others. She looked ready to run. I don't know what Arena has squeezed out of you, Egwene said quietly, but the extra lessons for Nicola stop now. Mirella and Nisao jumped, mirror images of surprise. Swan's eyes grew to the size of teacups, but luckily she recovered before anyone noticed. You really do know everything, Mirella whispered. All Arena wants is to be around Lan. I think she believes he'll teach her things she can use as a hunter, or maybe that he'll go off on the hunt with her. Nicola wants to be another Karigan, Nisao muttered caustically, or another Moiraine. I think she had some notion she could make Mirella give Lan's bond to her. Well, at least we can deal with that pair as they deserve now that he's out in the open. Whatever happens to me, it will be a joy to know they'll be squealing from here to year's end. Swan finally realized what had been going on, and outrage warred on her face with the wondering looks she directed at Egwene. That someone else had puzzled matters out first probably upset her as much as Nicola and Arena blackmailing Aes Sedai. Or perhaps not. Nicola and Arena were not Aes Sedai themselves, after all. That drastically changed Swan's view of what was allowed. But then it did the same for any sister. With so many eyes turned her way and not a friendly gaze in the lot, Nicola backed up against the oak tree and seemed to be trying to back further. Stains on that white dress would put her in hot water when she returned to the camp. Arena was still absorbed in Lan's horse, unaware of what was crashing down on her head. That would be justice, Egwene agreed, but not unless you two face full justice yourselves. Nobody was looking at Nicola anymore. Mirella's eyes filled her face, and Nisao's opened wider yet. Neither seemed to dare crack her teeth. Swan wore grim satisfaction like another skin. By her lights they deserved no mercy at all. Not that Egwene intended to give much. We will speak further when I come back, she told them, as Lan reappeared, his sword buckled on over a green coat undone to reveal an unlaced shirt, bulging saddlebags draped over his shoulder. The color-shifting warder cloak hanging down his back wrenched the eye as it swirled behind him. Leaving the stunned sisters to stew in their own juices, Egwene went to meet him. Swan would keep them on a fine simmer should they show any sign of falling off. I can have you in Ebudar sooner than a month, she said. He only nodded impatiently and called for Arena to bring Mandarb. His intensity was unnerving, an avalanche poised to fall, held back by a thread. Weaving a gateway where he had been practicing the sword, a good 8 feet by 8, she stepped through onto what seemed to be a ferry, floating in darkness that stretched forever. Skimming required a platform, and though it could be anything you chose to imagine, every sister seemed to have one she preferred. For her, that was this wooden barge with stout railings. If she fell off, she could make another barge beneath her, although where she came out then would be something of a question. But for anyone who could not channel, that fall would be as endless as the black that ran off in every direction. Only at the near end of the barge was there any light, the gateway giving a constricted view of the hollow. That light did not penetrate the darkness at all, yet there was light of a sort. At least she could see quite clearly, as in Tel Riyadh. Not for the first time she wondered whether this actually was some part of the world of dreams. Lan followed without needing to be told, leading his horse. He examined the gateway as he came through, studied the darkness as his boots and the stallion's hooves thudded across the deck planks to her. The only question he asked was, "How quickly will this take me to Abu Dar?" "It won't," she said, channeling to swing the gate shut, then closing the gateway. "Not right to the city." Nothing moved that anyone could have seen. There was no wind or breeze, nothing to feel. They were in motion, though, and fast. Faster than she could imagine anything moving. It must be 600 miles or more they had to go. "I can put you out 5, maybe 6 days north of Abu Dar." She had seen the gateway woven when Nynaeve and Elaine traveled south, and she remembered enough for skimming to the same place.
What?
He nodded, peering ahead as though he could see their destination. He reminded her of an arrow
Hey,
and a
gear
drawn
changer,
bow.
how you doing?
"Lan, Nynaeve is staying at the Tarasin Palace, a guest of Queen Tylan. She might deny she's in any danger."
Hope you're doing well,
Which she
bro.
certainly would, indignantly if Egwene knew Nynaeve, and rightfully so. "Try not to make a point of it, you know how stubborn she is, but you mustn't pay that any mind. If necessary, just protect her without letting her know." He said nothing, did not glance at her. She would have had 100 questions in his place. "Lan, when you find her, you must tell her that Mirella will give your bond to her as soon as you 3 can be together." She had thought of passing that information along herself, but it seemed better not to let Nynaeve know he was coming. She was as besotted with him as I am with Gawain, she thought ruefully. If Nynaeve knew he was on his way, there would be little room in her head for anything else. With the best will in the world, she would let the search fall on Elaine. Not that she would curl up and daydream, but any searching she did would be with dazzled eyes. "Are you listening to me, Lan?" "Tarasin Palace," he said in a flat voice without shifting his gaze. "Guest of Queen Tylan. Might deny she's in danger. Stubborn, as if I didn't know already." He looked at her then, and she almost wished he had not. She was full of Saidar, full of the warmth and the joy and the power, the sheer life, but something stark and primal raged in those cold blue eyes, a denial of life.
Huh?
His eyes were terrifying. That was all there
Chilling
was
by
to
the
it.
beach is always good.
"I will tell her everything she needs to know. You see, I listen." She made herself meet his stare without flinching, but he only
light
turned
left.
away again. There was a mark on his neck, a bruise. It might, just might, be a bite. Perhaps she should caution him, tell him he did not have to be too detailed in any explanations about himself and Mirella. The thought made her blush. She tried not to see the bruise, but now she had noticed it, she could not seem to see anything else. Anyway, he would not be that foolish. You could not expect a man to be sensible, but even men were not that scatterbrained. In silence they floated, moving without moving. She had no fears of the Forsaken suddenly appearing here, or anyone else. Skimming had its oddities, some of which made for safety and privacy. If 2 sisters wove gateways on the same spot only moments apart, aiming to skim to the same place, they would not see one another, not unless it was exactly the same spot, with the weaves exactly identical, and neither precision was as easy to achieve as it might seem. After a time, it was hard to tell how long exactly, but she thought well under half an hour, the barge stopped suddenly. Nothing altered in the feel, nor in the weaves she held. She simply knew that one moment they were speeding through the blackness, and the next standing still. Opening a gateway just at the barge's bow, she was not sure where one opened at the stern would lead, and not anxious to find out, frankly. Moghedien had found the very idea frightening. She motioned Lan to go ahead. The barge only existed so long as she was present, another thing like Tel'aran Riyod. He swung back the ferry gate leading Mandarb out, and when she followed, he was already in the saddle. She left the gateway open for her return. Low, rolling hills ran off in every direction, covered in withered grass. There was not a tree to be seen, nothing more than patches of shriveled scrub brush. The stallion's hooves kicked up little spurts of dust. The morning sun in that cloudless sky baked even hotter here than in Murundi. Long-winged vultures circled over something to the south, and in another place to the west. Lan, she began, meaning to make sure he understood what he was to tell Nynaeve, but he forestalled her. 5 or 6 days, you said, he said, peering south. I can make it faster. She will be safe, I promise. Mandarb danced, impatient as his rider, but Lan held him easily. You've come a very long way since Emmonsfield. Looking down at her, he smiled. Any warmth in it was swallowed by his eyes. You have a hold on Mirella and Nisao now. Don't let them argue with you again. By your command, Mother. The watch is not done. With a small bow, he dug in his heels, walking Mandarb just far enough to put her clear of the dust before setting the horse to a gallop. Watching him speed southward, she closed her mouth. Well, he had noticed in the middle of all that sword practice, noticed and done the sums correctly. Apparently including sums he could not have suspected before seeing her with the stole. Nynaeve had better take care. She always did think men were dimmer than they actually were. At least they can't get into any real trouble, she told herself aloud. Lan topped a hill and vanished over the other side. Had there been any real danger in Ebu Dar, Elaine or Nynaeve would have said something. They did not meet often. She just had too much to do. But they had worked out a way to leave messages in the Salidar of Tel'aran Riyod whenever there was need for one. A wind that might have come from an open oven gusted up sheets of dust. Coughing, she covered her mouth and nose with a corner of the Amerlin's striped stole and hurriedly retreated through the gateway to her ferry. The journey back was silent and boring, leaving her to worry whether she had done the right thing sending Lan, whether it was right to keep Nynaeve in the dark. It's done, she kept telling herself, but that did not help. When she stepped once more into the hilltop hollow beneath the oak trees, Mirella's third warder, Avar Hachami, had joined the others, a hawk-nosed man with thick gray-streaked mustaches like down-curving horns. All 4 Gaidin were hard at work, the tents down and nearly folded. Nicola and Arena trotted back and forth, loading all the camp paraphernalia into the cart, everything from blankets to cookpots and black iron wash kettle. They really did trot, not pausing, but at least half their attention was on Swan and the other 2 sisters, over near the tree line. For that matter, the warders gave the 3 Aes Sedai much more than half their consideration. Their ears might as well have been up in points. Who was simmering who seemed to be a question. Not speak to me in that manner, Swan, Mirella was saying. Not only loud enough to be heard across the clearing, but cold enough to take the edge off the weather. Arms folded tightly beneath her breasts, she was drawn up to every inch of height, imperious to the point of bursting. Do you hear me? You will not. Are you lost to all propriety, Swan? Nisao's hands were knotted in her skirts in a vain attempt to keep herself from quivering, and the heat in her voice easily matched the ice in Mirella's. If you've forgotten simple manners completely, you can be taught again. Facing them with her hands on her hips, Swan moved her head jerkily, struggling both to keep a glare on her face and to keep it fixed on the other 2. I am only... When she saw Egwene approaching, her relief bloomed like a flower in spring. Mother, that was almost a gasp. I was explaining possible penalties. She drew a long breath and went on more definitely. The Hall will have to invent them as they go, of course, but I think they might well start with making these two pass their warders to others, since they seem so fond of it." Mirella squeezed her eyes shut, and Nisao turned to look at the warders. Her expression never changed, calm if a touch flushed, but Saren stumbled to his feet and took 3 quick steps toward her before she raised a hand to stop him. A warder could sense his Aes Sedai's presence, her pain, her fear and anger, every bit as much as Egwene could feel Mogedian's when she wore the Eidam. No wonder all the Gaidin moved on their toes and looked ready to spring at something. They might not know what had driven their Aes Sedai to the brink of despair, but they knew the 2 women were at that brink. Which was exactly where Egwene wanted them. She did not like this part of it. All the maneuvering was like a game, but this... "I do what I must," she thought, unsure whether that was an attempt to stiffen her backbone or an attempt to excuse what she was about to do. "Swan, please send Nicola and Arena back to the camp." What they did not see, they could not tell. "We can't have their tongues flapping, so make sure they know what will happen to them. Tell them they have one more chance, because the Amerlin is feeling merciful, but they'll never get another." "I think I can manage that much," Swan replied, and gathering her skirts, she stalked off. No one could stalk like Swan, yet she seemed more eager to be away from Mirella and Nisao than anything else. "Mother," Nisao said, choosing her words, "before you left, you said something indicated there might be some way for us to avoid... some way we might not have to..." She glanced at Saren again. Mirella would have been a study in Aes Sedai's serenity as she examined Egwene, except that her fingers were laced together so tightly that her knuckles strained the thin leather of her gloves. Egwene motioned them to wait. Nicola and Arena, turning away from the cart, saw Swan coming and went stiff as posts, which was no wonder, considering that Swan advanced as though she intended to walk right over them and the cart. Arena's head swiveled, searching, but before she could think to actually run, Swan's hands darted out and caught each of them by an ear. What she said was too low to carry, yet Arena stopped trying to pry her ear free. Her hand stayed on Swan's wrist, but she almost seemed to be using it to hold herself up. A look of such horror oozed across Nicola's face that Egwene wondered whether Swan might be going too far. But then maybe not, under the circumstances. They were going to walk free of their crime. A pity she could not find a way to harness such a talent for ferreting out what was hidden, a way to harness it safely. Whatever Swan said when she loosed their ears, the pair immediately turned toward Egwene and dropped into curtsies. Nicola's was so low it nearly put her face on the ground, and Arena came close to falling on hers. Swan clapped hands sharply, and the 2 women bounded to their feet, scrambled to untie a pair of shaggy wagon horses from the picket line. They were astride bareback and galloping out of the hollow so quickly it was a wonder they did not have wings. "They won't even talk in their sleep," Swan said sourly when she returned. "I can still handle novices and scoundrels, at least." Her eyes stayed on Egwene's face, avoiding the other 2 sisters entirely. Suppressing a sigh, Egwene turned to Mirella and Nisao. She had to do something about Swan, but first things first. The green sister and the brown eyed her warily. "It is very simple," she said in a firm voice. "Without my protection, you will very likely lose your warders, and almost certainly wish you'd been skinned alive by the time the Hall finishes with you. Your own Ajahs may have a few choice words for you as well. It may be years before you can hold your heads up again, years before you don't have sisters looking over your shoulder every minute. But why should I protect you from justice? It puts me under an obligation. You might do the same again, or worse." The wise ones had their part in this, though it was not exactly Ji'ito. "If I'm to take on that responsibility, then you must have an obligation too. I must be able to trust you utterly, and I can only see one way to do that." The wise ones, and then Phaolane and Theodrin. "You must swear fealty." They'd been frowning, wondering where she was headed, but wherever they thought, it was not where she ended. Their faces were a study. Nisao's jaw dropped, and Mirella looked as though she had been hit between the eyes with a hammer. Even Swan gaped in disbelief. "Impossible," Mirella spluttered. "No sister has ever... No Amerlin has required... You can't really think..." "Oh, do be quiet, Mirella," Nisao snapped. "This is all your fault. I should never have listened. Well, done is done, and what is, is." Peering at Egwene from beneath lowered brows, she muttered, "You are a dangerous young woman, Mother. A very dangerous woman. You may break the tower more than it already is before you're done. If I was sure of that, if I had the courage to do my duty and face whatever comes..." Yet she knelt smoothly, pressing her lips to the great serpent ring on Egwene's finger. "Beneath the light and by my hope of rebirth and salvation..." Not the same wording as Phaelane and Theodrin, but every scrap as strong. More. By the 3 oaths, no Aes Sedai could speak a vow she did not mean. Except the Black Aja, of course. It seemed obvious they must have found a way to lie. Whether either of these women was black was a problem for another time, though. Swan, eyes popping and mouth working without a sound, looked like a fish stranded on a mudbank. Mirella tried another protest, but Egwene just thrust out her right hand with the ring, and Mirella's knees folded in jerks. She gave the oath in bitter tones, then looked up. "You've done what has never been done before, Mother. That is always dangerous." "It won't be the last time," Egwene told her. "In fact, my first order to you is that you will tell no one that Swan is anything but what everybody thinks. My second is, you will obey any order she gives, as if it came from me." Their heads turned toward Swan, faces unruffled. "As you command, Mother," they murmured together. It was Swan who looked ready to faint. She was still staring at nothing when they reached the road and turned their horses east toward the Aes Sedai camp and the army. The sun still climbed toward its zenith, still well short. It had been a morning eventful as most days, most weeks for that matter. Egwene let Daishar amble. "Mirella was right," Swan mumbled finally. With her rider's mind elsewhere, the mare moved with something close to a smooth gait. She actually made Swan appear a competent rider. Fealty. No one has ever done that. No one. There isn't so much as a hint in the secret histories. And them, obeying me. You aren't just changing a few things. You're rebuilding the boat while sailing a storm. Everything is changing. And Nicola. In my day, a novice would have wet herself if she even thought of blackmailing a sister. "Not their first attempt," Egwene told her, relating the facts in as few words as possible. She expected Swan to explode in a fury at the pair, but instead the woman said quite calmly, "I fear our 2 adventurous lasses are about to meet with accidents." "No." Egwene reined in so suddenly that Swan's mare ambled another 6 paces before she could bring the animal under control and turn her, all the while muttering imprecations under her breath. She sat there, giving Egwene a patient look that outdid Lilane at her worst. "Mother, they have a club over your head if they're ever smart enough to think it out. Even if the Hall doesn't force you into a penance, you can watch any hope you have with them sail right over the horizon." She shook her head disgustedly. "I knew you would do it when I sent you out. I knew you'd have to. But I never thought Elaine and Nynaeve were witless enough to bring back anyone who knew. Those 2 girls deserve all they'll catch if this gets out. But you can't afford to let it out. Nothing is to happen to Nicola or Arena, Swan. If I approve killing them for what they know, who's next? Romanda and Lilane? For not agreeing with me? Where does it stop?" In a way, she felt disgusted with herself. Once she would not have understood what Swan meant. It was always better to know than to be ignorant, but sometimes ignorance was much more comfortable. Heeling Daishar on, she said, "I won't have a day of victory spoiled with talk of murder. Mirella wasn't even the beginning, Swan. This morning, Phaelane and Theodrin were waiting." Swan brought the plump mare in closer to listen as they rode. The news did not relieve Swan's concern over Nicola and Arena, but Egwene's plan certainly put a sparkle in her eye and a smile of anticipation on her lips. By the time they reached the Aes Sedai camp, she was eager to take on her next task, which was to tell Shiriam and the rest of Mirella's friends that they were expected in the Amerlin's study at midday. She could even say quite truthfully that nothing would be required of them that other sisters had not done before. For all her talk of victory, Egwene did not feel so zestful. She barely heard blessings and calls for blessings, acknowledging them with only a wave of her hand, and was sure she missed more than she did hear. She could not countenance murder, but Nicola and Arena would bear watching. Will I ever reach a place where the difficulties don't keep piling up? She wondered. Somewhere a victory did not seem to have to be matched by a new danger. When she walked into her tent, her mood sank right to her feet. Her head throbbed. She was beginning to think she should just stay away from the tent altogether. 2 carefully folded sheets of parchment sat neatly atop the writing table, each sealed with wax and each bearing the words, "Sealed to the flame." For anyone other than the Amerlin, breaking that seal was accounted as serious as assaulting the Amerlin's person. She wished she did not have to break them. There was no doubt in her mind who had written those words. Unfortunately, she was right. Romanda suggested, demanded was a better word, that the Amerlin issue an edict sealed to the hall, known only to the sitters. The sisters were all to be summoned one by one, and any who refused was to be shielded and confined as a suspected member of the Black Aja. What they were to be summoned for was left rather vague, but Lelaine had more than hinted this morning. Lelaine's own missive bore her manner all over it, mother to child, what should be done for Egwene's own good and everyone's. The edict she wanted was only to be sealed to the ring. Any sister could know, and in fact, in this case, they would have to. Mention of the Black Aja was to be forbidden as fomenting discord, a serious charge under Tower law, with appropriate penalties. Egwene dropped onto her folding chair with a groan, and of course the legs shifted and nearly deposited her on the carpet. She could delay and sidestep, but they would keep coming back with these idiocies. Sooner or later, one would introduce her modest proposal to the hall, and that would put the fox in the hen yard. Were they blind? Fomenting discord? Lelaine would have every sister convinced not just that there was a Black Aja, but that Egwene was part of it. The stampede of Aes Sedai back to Tar Valon and Elida could not be far behind. Romanda just meant to set off a mutiny. There were 6 of those hidden in the secret histories. Half a dozen in more than 3,000 years might not be very many, but each had resulted in an Amerlin resigning, and the entire hall as well. Lelaine knew that, and Romanda. Lelaine had been a sitter for nearly 40 years, with access to all the hidden records. Before resigning to go into a country retreat, as many sisters did in age, Romanda had held a chair for the Yellow so long that some said she had had as much power as any Amerlin she sat under. Being chosen to sit a second time was nearly unheard of, but Romanda was not one to let power reside anywhere outside her own hands, if she could manage. No, they were not blind, just afraid. Everybody was, including her, and even Aes Sedai did not always think clearly when they were afraid. She refolded the pages, wanting to crumple them up and stamp her feet on them. Her head was going to burst. "May I come in, Mother?" Halima Saranov swayed into the tent without waiting for an answer. The way Halima moved always drew every male eye from age 12 to 2 days past the grave. But then if she hid herself in a heavy cloak from the shoulders down, men still would stare. Long black hair, glistening as if she washed it every day in fresh rainwater, framed a face that made sure of that. "Delana Sedai thought you might want to see this. She's putting it before the hall this morning." The hall was sitting without so much as informing her. Well, she had been away, but custom, if not law, said the Amerlin must be informed before the hall could sit, unless they were sitting to depose her anyway. At that moment, she would almost have taken it as a blessing. She eyed the folded sheet of paper Halima laid on her table much as she would a poisonous snake. Not sealed, The newest novice could read it, so far as Delana was concerned. The declaration that Elida was a dark friend, of course. Not quite as bad as Romanda or Lelaine, but if she heard the hall had broken up in a riot, she would hardly blink. Halima, I could wish you'd gone home when Cabriana died. Or at least that Delana had had the sense to seal the woman's information to the hall, or even to the flame, instead of telling every sister she could collar. I could hardly do that, Mother. Halima's green eyes flashed with what seemed challenge or defiance, but she only had two ways to look at anyone: a wide, direct stare that dared, and a lidded gaze that smoldered. Her eyes caused a lot of misunderstanding. After Cabriana Sedai told me what she'd learned about Elida and her plans, Cabriana was my friend, and friend to you, to all of you opposing Elida, so I had no choice. I only thanked the light she mentioned Salidar, so I knew where to come. She put her hands on a waist as small as Egwene's had been in Tel Iran Riod, and tilted her head to one side, studying Egwene intently. Your brain is hurting again, isn't it? Cabriana used to have such pains, so bad they made her toes cramp. She had to soak in hot water till she could bear to put on clothes. It took days sometimes. If I hadn't come, yours could have gotten that bad eventually. Moving around behind the chair, she began kneading Egwene's scalp. Halima's fingers possessed a skill that melted pain away. You could hardly ask another sister for healing as often as you have these aches. It's just tightness anyway. I can feel it. I suppose I couldn't, Egwene murmured. She rather liked the woman, whatever anyone said, and not just for her talent in smoothing away headaches. Halima was earthy and open, a countrywoman, however much time she had spent gaining a skim of city sophistication, balancing respect for the Amerlin with a sort of neighborliness in a way Egwene found refreshing. Startling sometimes, but enlivening. Even Chesa did not do better, but Chesa was always the servant, even if friendly, while Halima never showed the slightest obsequiousness. Yet Egwene really did wish she had gone back to her home when Cabriana fell from that horse and broke her neck. It might have been useful had the sisters accepted Cabriana's belief that Elida intended to still half of them and break the rest, but everyone was sure Halima had garbled that somehow. It was the black Aja they latched onto. Women unused to being afraid of anything had taken what they had always denied and terrified themselves half-witless with it. How was she to root the dark friends out without scattering the other sisters like a frightened covey of quail? How to stop them scattering sooner or later anyway? Light. How? Think on looseness, Halima said softly. Your face is loose. Your neck is loose. Your shoulders. Her voice was almost hypnotic, a drone that seemed to caress each part of Egwene's body she wanted to relax. Some women disliked her just for the way she looked, of course, as though a particularly lascivious man had dreamed her, and a good many claimed she flirted with anything in breeches, which Egwene could not have approved of. But Halima admitted she liked looking at men. Her worst critics never claimed she had done more than flirt, and she herself became indignant at the suggestion. She was no fool. Egwene had known that at their first conversation, the day after Loghain escaped, when the headaches had begun. Not at all the brainless flipskirt. Egwene suspected it was much as with Mary. Halima could not help her face or her manner. Her smile seemed inviting or teasing because of the shape of her mouth. She smiled the same at man or woman or child. It was hardly her fault that people thought she was flirting when she was only looking. Besides, she had never mentioned the headaches to anyone. If she had, every yellow sister in the camp would be laying siege. That indicated friendship, if not loyalty. Egwene's eyes fell on the papers on the writing table, and her thoughts drifted under Halima's stroking fingers. Torches ready to be tossed into the haystack. 10 days to the border of Andor, unless Lord Bryn was willing to push without knowing why, and no opposition before. Could she hold those torches back 10 days? South Harbor, North Harbor, the keys to Tar Valon. How could she be sure of Nicola and Arena, short of Swan's suggestion? She needed to arrange for every sister to be tested before they reached Andor. She had the talent for working with metals and ores, but it was rare among Aes Sedai. Nicola, Arena, the Black Aja. You're tensing again. Stop worrying over the hall. Those soothing fingers paused, then began once more. This would do better tonight, after you've had a hot bath. I could work your shoulders and back everywhere. We haven't tried that yet. You're stiff as a stake. You should be supple enough to bend backwards and put your head between your ankles. Mind and body. One can't be limber without the other. Just put yourself in my hands. Egwene teetered on the brink of sleep. Not a dream-walker's sleep, just sleep. How long since she had done that? The camp would be in an uproar once Delana's proposal got out, which it would soon enough, and that was before she had to tell Ramonda and Lelaine she had no intention of issuing their edicts. But there was one thing yet today to look forward to, a reason to remain awake. That will be nice, she murmured, meaning more than the promised massage. Long ago she had pledged that one day she would bring Shiriam to heel, and today was the day. At last she was beginning to be the Amyrlin, in control. Very nice. Chapter 13. The Bowl of the Winds. Aviendha would have sat on the floor, but 3 other women occupying the boat's small room left not quite enough space, so she had to be content with folding her legs atop one of the carved wooden benches built against the walls. That way it was not so much like sitting in a chair. At least the door was shut, and there were no windows, only fanciful carved scrollwork piercing the walls near the ceiling. She could not see the water outside, but the piercings let in the smell of salt and the slap of waves against the hull and the splash of the oars. Even the shrill, hollow cries of some sort of birds shouted of vast expanses of water. She had seen men die for a pool they might have stepped across, but this water was bitter beyond belief. Reading of it was not at all the same as tasting it. And the river had been at least half a mile wide where they boarded this boat with its 2 oddly leering oarsmen. Half a mile of water, and not a drop fit for drinking. Who could imagine useless water? The motion of the boat had changed to a rocking back and forth. Were they out of the river yet? Into what was called the bay? That was wider still, far wider, so Elaine said. Aviendha locked her hands on her knees and tried desperately to think of anything else. If the others saw her fear, the shame would follow her to the end of her days. The worst of it was she had suggested this, after hearing Elaine and Nynaeve talk of the sea folk. How could she have known what it would be like? The blue silk of her dress felt incredibly smooth, and she latched onto that. She was barely used to skirts at all. She still yearned for the Kadinsor the wise ones had made her burn when she began training with them. And here she wore a silk dress, of which she now owned 4, and silk stockings instead of stout wool, and a silk shift that made her aware of her skin in a way she never had been before. She could not deny the beauty of the dress, no matter how odd it was to find herself wearing such things, but silk was precious and rare. A woman might have a scarf of silk, to be worn on feast days and envied by others. Few women had 2. It was different among these wetlanders, though. Not everyone wore silk, yet sometimes it seemed to her every second person did. Great bolts and even bales of it came by ship from the lands beyond the threefold land. By ship, on the ocean. Water stretching to the horizon, with many places where, if she understood correctly, you could not see land at all. She came close to shivering at the impossible thought. None of the others looked as if they wished to talk. Elaine absently twisted the great serpent ring on her right hand and peered at something not to be seen inside the 4 walls. These worries often overtook her. 2 duties confronted her, and if one lay nearer her heart, she had chosen the one she considered more important, more honorable. It was her right and duty to become the chief, the queen of Andor, but she had chosen to continue hunting. In a way, however important their search, that was like putting something before clan or society, yet Aviendha felt pride. Elaine's view of honor was as peculiar at times as the notion of a woman being a chief, or her becoming chief just because her mother had been, but she followed it admirably. Brigitta, in the wide red trousers and short yellow coat Avienda envied, sat toying with her waist-long braid, lost in thought as well, or maybe sharing part of Elaine's worries. She was Elaine's first warder, which upset the Aes Sedai back in the Tarasin Palace no end, though it did not seem to bother their warders. Wetlander customs were so curious they hardly bore thinking about. If Elaine and Brigitta seemed to deflect any thought of talk, Nynaeve Almira, directly opposite Avienda by the door, rebuffed it firmly. Nynaeve, not Nynaeve Almira. Wetlanders like to be called by only half their names, and Avienda was trying to remember, however much it felt like using a honey name. Rand al'Thor was the only lover she had ever had, and she did not think even of him so intimately. But she had to learn their ways if she was to wed one of them. Nynaeve's deep brown eyes stared through her. Her knuckles were white on a thick braid as dark as Brigitta's was golden, and her face had gone beyond pale to a faint green. From time to time she emitted a tiny muted groan. She did not usually sweat. She and Elaine had taught Avienda the trick. Nynaeve was a puzzle. Brave to the point of madness sometimes, she moaned over her supposed cowardice, and here she displayed her shame for all to see without a care. How could the motion disturb her so when all that water did not? Water again. Avienda shut her eyes to avoid seeing Nynaeve's face, but that only made the sounds of the birds and the lapping water fill her head. "I have been thinking," Elaine said suddenly, then paused. "Are you all right, Avienda? You—" Avienda's cheeks reddened, but at least Elaine did not say aloud that she had jumped like a rabbit at the sound of her voice. Elaine seemed to realize how close she had come to revealing Avienda's dishonor. Color flushed her own cheeks as she continued. "I was thinking about Nicola and Arena, about what Egwene told us last night. You don't suppose they can cause her any trouble, do you? What is she to do?" "Rid herself of them," Avienda said, drawing a thumb across her neck. The relief of speaking, of hearing voices, was so great that she almost gasped. Elaine appeared shocked. She was remarkably soft-hearted at times. "It might be for the best," Brigitta said. She had revealed no more name than that. Avienda thought her a woman with secrets. "Arena could have made something of herself with time, but don't look at me that way, Elaine, and stop going all prim and indignant in your head." Brigitta often slipped back and forth between the warder who obeyed and the older first sister who instructed whether or not you wished to learn.
How you doing?
Right then, waving an
Let's do it,
admonishing finger, she was the first sister.
How's your
You
evening
two
going,
wouldn't have been
Soy?
warned to stay away if it was a difficulty the Amerlin could solve by having them set to work with the laundresses or the like. Elaine gave a sharp sniff in the face of what she could not deny, and adjusted her green silk skirts where they were drawn up in front to expose
Safety
layers of
meeting
blue and
time.
white petticoats. She was wearing the local fashion, complete with creamy lace at her wrists and around her neck, a gift from Tylin Quintara, as was the close-fitting necklace of woven gold. Avienda did not approve. The upper half of the dress, the bodice, fitted as snugly as that
Right.
necklace, and a missing narrow oval of cloth revealed the inner slopes of her breasts. Walking about where all could see was not the same as the sweat tents. People in the streets of the city were not guy-shame. Her own dress had a high neck that left her chin with lace, and no parts of it missing. "Besides," Brigitta went on, "I would think Marigan would worry you more. She frightens me spitless." That name got through to Nynaeve, as well it might. Her groaning ceased and she sat up straight. "If she comes after us, we will just settle for her again. We'll... Drawing breath, she stared at them pointedly as if they were arguing with her. What she said in a faint voice was, "Do you think she will?" "Fretting will do no good," Elaine told her, much more calmly than Avienda could have managed if she thought one of the Shadow Souled had marked her out. "We will just have to do as Egwene said and be careful. Nynaeve muttered something inaudible, which was probably just as well. Silence descended again, Elaine settling to a browner study than before, Birgitta propping her chin on one hand as she frowned at nothing. Nynaeve kept right on grumbling under her breath, but she had both hands pressed to her middle now, and from time to time she paused to swallow. The splashing of water seemed louder than ever, and the cries of the birds. I have been thinking too, near sister. She and Elaine had not reached the point of adopting each other as first sisters yet, but she was sure they would now. Already they brushed each other's hair, and every night in the dark shared another secret never told to anyone else. This Min woman, though, that was for later, when they were alone. About what? Elaine asked absently. Our search. We prepare for success, but we are as far away as when we began. Does it make sense not to use every weapon at hand? Matt Cawthon is Taviran, yet we work to avoid him. Why not take him with us? With him we might find the bowl at last. Matt? Nynaeve exclaimed incredulously. As well stuff your shift full of nettles. I would not endure the man if he had the bowl in his coat pocket. Oh, do be quiet, Nynaeve, Elaine murmured, without any heat. She shook her head wonderingly, taking no notice of the other's sudden glower. Prickly only began to describe Nynaeve, but they were all used to her ways. Why didn't I think of that? It's so obvious. Maybe, Birgitta murmured dryly. You had Matt the scoundrel set so hard in your mind you couldn't see he had any use. Elaine gave her a cool stare, chin raised, then abruptly grimaced and nodded reluctantly. She did not accept criticism easily. No, Nynaeve said in a voice that somehow managed to be sharp and weak at the same time. The sickly cast of her face had deepened, but it no longer seemed caused by the boat's heaving. You cannot possibly mean it. Elaine, you know what a torment he can be, how stubborn he is. He'll insist on bringing those soldiers of his like a feast day parade. Try finding anything in the Rahad with soldiers at your shoulder. Just try. Inside 2 steps, he'll try to take charge, flaunting that Turangreal at us. He's 1,000 times worse than Van Deen or Adelius, or even Marililla. The way he behaves, you would think we'd walk into a bear's den just to see the bear. Birgitta made a noise in her throat that might have been amusement, and received a darted glare. She returned such a look of bland innocence that Nynaeve began to sound as if she were choking. Elaine was more soothing. She probably would try to make peace in a water feud. He is Taviran, Nynaeve. He alters the pattern, alters chance just being there. I'm ready to admit we need luck, and a Taviran is more than luck. Besides, we can snare 2 birds at once. We should not have been letting him run loose all this time, no matter how busy we were. That's done no one any good, him least of all. He needs to be made fit for decent company. We will put him on a short rein from the start. Nynaeve smoothed her skirts with considerable vigor. She claimed to have no more interest in dresses than Avienda, in what they looked like anyway. She was always muttering about good plain wool being fine enough for anybody, yet her own blue dress was slashed with yellow on the skirts and sleeves, and she herself had chosen its design. Every stitch she owned was silk or embroidered or both, all cut with what Avienda had learned to recognize as fine care. For once, Nynaeve appeared to understand she would not get her way. Sometimes she threw amazing tantrums until she did, not that she would admit that was what they were. The glower faded to a grumpy sulk. Who will ask him? Whoever does, he will make her beg. You know he will. I'd sooner marry her. Elaine hesitated, then said firmly, Birgitta will, and she won't beg, she will tell him. Most men will do as you say if you use a firm, confident voice. Nynaeve looked doubtful, and Birgitta jerked erect on her bench, startled for the first time Avienda had ever seen. With anyone else, Avienda might have said she looked a little afraid, too. Birgitta would have done very well as Far Dar-Ismai for a wetlander. She had remarkable skill with a bow. You are the clear choice, Birgitta, Elaine went on quickly. Nynaeve and I are Aes Sedai, and Avienda might as well be. We cannot possibly do it. Not and maintain proper dignity. Not with him. You know what he is like. What had happened to all that talk of a firm, confident voice? Not that Avienda had ever noticed that working for anyone except Cerelia. It surely had not so far unmapped Quathon that she had seen. Brigitta, he can't have recognized you. If he had, he would have said something by now. Whatever that meant, Brigitta leaned back against the wall and laced her fingers over her stomach. I should have known you'd get back at me ever since I said it was a good thing your bottom wasn't any... She stopped, and a faint, satisfied smile appeared on her lips. Nothing changed in Elaine's expression, but plainly Brigitta thought she had gained a measure of revenge. It must have been something felt through the warder bond. How Elaine's bottom entered into anything, though, Avienda could not puzzle out. Wetlanders were so odd at times. Brigitta continued, still wearing that smile. What I don't understand is why he starts chafing as soon as he sees you two. It can't be that you snagged him off here. Egwene was as deep in that as you, but I saw him treat her with more respect than most of the sisters do. Besides the times I've glimpsed him coming out of the Wandering Woman, he looked to be enjoying himself. Her smile became a grin that made Elaine sniff disapprovingly. That is one thing we need to change. A decent woman cannot be in the room with him. Oh, do wipe that smirk off your face, Brigitta. I vow you are as bad as he sometimes. The man was born just to be a trial, Nynaeve muttered sourly. Suddenly, Avienda was forcibly reminded that she was on a boat, as everything lurched, swaying and swinging around to a halt. Rising and straightening dresses, they gathered the light cloaks they had brought. She did not don hers. The sunlight here was not so bright that she needed the hood to keep it from her eyes. Brigitta only draped hers over one shoulder and pushed open the door, following up the 3 steps after Nynaeve had rushed past her, with a hand clapped over her mouth. Elaine paused to tie her cloak ribbons and arrange the hood around her face, red gold curls peeking out all around. You did not say much, near sister. I said what I had to say. The decision was yours. The key thought was yours, though. Sometimes I think the rest of us are turning into half-wits. Well, half turning to the steps, not quite looking at her, Elaine paused. Distances bother me sometimes, over water. I think I will look only at the ship, myself. Nothing else. Avienda nodded. Her near sister had a fine delicacy, and they went up. On the deck, Nynaeve was just shaking off Brigitta's offer of help and pushing herself up from the railing. The 2 oarsmen looked on in amusement as she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Shirtless fellows with a brass hoop in each ear, they must have had frequent use for the curved daggers shoved behind their sashes. Most of their attention went to working their pairs of long sweeps, though, walking back and forth on the deck to hold the heaving boat in place near a ship that almost took Avienda's breath with its size, looming above their suddenly very tiny vessel, its 3 great masts reaching taller than most trees she had seen even here in the wetlands. They had chosen it because it was the largest of the hundreds of seafolk ships anchored in the bay. On a ship that big, surely it must be possible to forget all the surrounding water. Except... Elaine had not really acknowledged her shame, and if she had, a near sister could know your deepest humiliation without it mattering, but Amis said she had too much pride. She made herself turn and look away from the boat. She had never seen so much water in her life. Not if every drop seen before had been gathered in one place, all of it rolling gray-green and here and there frothing white. Her eyes darted, trying to avoid taking it in. Even the sky seemed larger here, immense, with a liquid gold sun crawling up from the east. A gusting wind blew, somewhat cooler than on the land, and never failing entirely. Clouds of birds flurried in the air, gray and white and sometimes splotched with black, giving those shrill cries. One, all black except for its head, skimmed along the surface with its long lower beak slicing through the water, and a slanted line of ungainly brown birds, pelicans Elaine had named them, suddenly folded their wings one by one and plummeted with great splashes, bobbing back to the top, where they floated, tilting up beaks of incredible size. There were ships everywhere, many almost as large as the one behind her, not all belonging to the Atha-an-Mier, and smaller vessels with one or two masts moving under triangular sails. Smaller ships still, mastless like the boat she was on, with a high sharp peak at the front and a low flat house at the back, spidered across the water on oars, one pair or two, or sometimes three. One long narrow boat that must have had 20 to a side looked like 100 legs skittering along. And there was land. Maybe 7 or 8 miles distant, sunlight gleamed off the white plastered buildings of the city. 7 or 8 miles of water. Swallowing, she turned back more swiftly than she had turned away. She thought her cheeks must be greener than Nynaeve's had been. Elaine was watching her, trying to keep a smooth face, but wetlanders showed their emotions so plainly her concern was visible. "I am a fool, Elaine." Even with her, using no more of her name made Aviendha feel uneasy. When they were first sisters, when they were sister wives, it would be easier. A wise woman listens to wise advice. "You are braver than I will ever be," Elaine replied, quite seriously. She was another who kept denying that she had any courage. Maybe that was also a wetlander custom? No. Aviendha had heard wetlanders speak of their own bravery. These Ebudari, for one, seemed unable to utter 3 words without boasting. Elaine drew a deep breath, steeling herself. "Tonight we will talk about Rand." Aviendha nodded, but she did not see how that followed from talk of courage. How could sister wives manage a husband if they did not talk of him in detail? That was what the older women told her anyway, and the wise ones. They were not always so forthcoming, of course. When she complained to Amis and Bear that she must be ill because she felt as though Rand al'Thor was carrying some part of her around with him, they had fallen down laughing. "You will learn," they cackled at her, and "you would have learned sooner had you grown up in skirts." As if she had ever wanted any life but that of a maiden, running with her spear sisters. Maybe Elaine felt something of the same emptiness. Speaking of him did seem to make the hollowness grow, even while filling it. For some time she had been aware of voices rising, and now she heard the words. "You earringed buffoon!" Nynaeve was shaking her fist at a very dark man peering down at her from over the tall side of the ship. He looked calm, but then he could not see the glow of Saidar surrounding her. "We are not after the gift of passage, so it doesn't matter whether you refuse it to Aes Sedai. You let down a ladder this instant." The men at the oars were missing their grins. Apparently they had failed to see the serpent rings back at the stone landing, and they did not look pleased to learn they had Aes Sedai aboard. "Oh dear," Elaine sighed. "I must retrieve this, Aviendha, or we've wasted the morning just so she could lose her breakfast porridge." Gliding across the deck, Aviendha was proud of knowing the proper names for things on boats, Elaine addressed the man up on the ship. "I am Elaine Trakand, daughter heir of Andor and Aes Sedai of the Green Aja. My companion is quite truthful. We do not seek the gift of passage, but we must speak with your wind finder on a matter of urgency. Tell her we know of the weaving of winds. Tell her we know of wind finders." The man above frowned down at her, then abruptly vanished without a word. "The woman will probably think you mean to blab her secrets," Nynaeve muttered, jerking her cloak into place. She tied the ribbons fiercely. "You know how afraid they are that Aes Sedai will haul them all off to the tower, if it's known most can channel. Only a ninny thinks she can threaten people, Elaine, and still get anywhere." Aviendha burst out laughing. By the startled look Nynaeve gave her, she did not see the joke she had made on herself. Elaine's lips quivered, though, however she tried to hold them. You could never be sure about wetlander humor. They found strange things funny and missed the best. Whether or not the Windfinder felt threatened, by the time Elaine had paid the boatmen and cautioned them to wait for their return, with Nynaeve grumbling over the amount, and telling them she would box their ears if they left, and how she was to manage that nearly set Avienda laughing again. By the time all that was done, it seemed a decision had been reached to allow them on. No ladder was lowered, but instead a flat piece of wood, the two ropes it hung from becoming one and running up to a thick pole swung out over the side from one of the masts. Nynaeve took her place sitting on the board with dire warnings for the boatmen if they even thought of trying to look up her skirts, and Elaine blushed and held hers tightly around her legs, hunched over so she appeared ready to fall off head first as she wobbled into the air and disappeared from sight onto the ship. One of the fellows looked upward anyway, until Birgitta struck him on the nose with her fist. They certainly did not watch her ascent. Avienda's belt knife was small, with a blade not half a foot long, but the oarsmen frowned worriedly when she drew it. Her arm went back, and they fell sprawling to the deck as the knife whirled over their heads to sink with a solid thunk into the thick wooden post at the front of the boat. Looping the cloak over her arms like a shawl, she hoisted her skirts well above her knees so she could climb over the oars and retrieve her blade, then took her place on the dangling board. She did not replace the knife in its sheath. For some reason, the two men exchanged confused looks, but they kept their eyes down as she was lifted up. Perhaps she was beginning to get a feel for Wetlander customs. Settling onto the great ship's deck, she gaped, almost forgetting to climb off the narrow seat. She had read of the Atha an Mier, but reading and seeing was as different as reading of salt water and tasting it. They were all dark, for one thing, much darker than the Ebudari, even darker than most Tyrans, with straight black hair and black eyes and tattooed hands. Bare-chested, barefoot men with bright narrow sashes holding up baggy breeches of some dark cloth that had an oily look to it, and women in blouses as brilliantly colored as their sashes, all with a sway to their movements, gliding gracefully with the rocking of the ship. Seafolk women had very strange customs when it came to men, according to what she had read, dancing with no more than a single scarf for covering and worse, but it was the earrings that made her stare. Most had 3 or 4, often with polished stones, and several actually had a small ring in one side of their noses. The men did too, the earrings at least, and just as many heavy gold and silver chains around their necks. Men! Some Wetlander men wore rings in their ears, true. Most Ebudari men seemed to, but so many. And necklaces! Wetlanders did have strange ways. The seafolk never left their ships. Never, so she had read, and supposedly they ate their dead. She had not been quite able to credit that, but if the men wore necklaces, who could say what else they did? The woman who came to meet them wore breeches and blouse and sash like the others, but hers were of brocaded yellow silk, the sash knotted intricately with ends trailing to her knee.
Yeah, I've had some moon rocks before.
And one of her necklaces bore a small golden box
It
of
comes
intricate
around
piercework.
once in a while here, but
A
not
sweetly
too
musky
often.
scent surrounded her. Gray streaked her hair heavily, and she had a grave face. 5 small, fat golden rings decorated each of her ears, and a fine chain connected one to a similar ring in her nose. Tiny medallions of polished gold dangling from the chain flashed in the sunlight as she studied them. Avienda pulled her hand down from her own nose to where that chain, always tugging, and barely managed to suppress a laugh. Wetlander customs were odd beyond belief, and surely no one deserved the name better than the seafolk. "I am Malin Dintoral Breaking Wave," the woman said. "Wave mistress of Clan Somarin and sail mistress of Windrunner." A wave mistress was important, like a clan chief, yet she seemed at a loss, looking from one face to the next, until her eye fell on the great serpent rings Elaine and Nynaeve wore, and then she exhaled in resignation. "If it pleases you to come with me, Aes Sedai," she said to Nynaeve. The back of the ship was raised, and she led the way inside that by a door, then down a hallway to a large room, a cabin, with a low ceiling. Avienda doubted Randall Thor would have been able to stand upright beneath one of the thick beams. Except for a few lacquered chests, everything seemed to have been built in place, cabinets along the walls, even the long table that ran half the length of the room, and the armchairs that surrounded it. It was difficult to think of something the size of this ship being made of wood, and even after all her time in the wetlands, the sight of all that polished wood nearly made her gasp. It glowed almost as much as the gilded lamps, hanging unlit in some sort of cage, so they remained upright as the ship moved with the waves.
Solid white.
In truth, the ship hardly seemed to move at all, at least in comparison with the boat they had been on. But unfortunately, the back of the cabin, of the ship, was a line of windows with the painted and gilded shutters standing open, giving a splendid view of the bay. Worse, there was no land in sight out those windows. No land at all. Her throat seized. She could not have spoken. She could not have screamed, although that was what she wanted to do. Those windows and what they showed, what they did not show, had caught her eyes so quickly that it took her a moment to realize people were there already. A fine thing. Had they wished, they could have killed her before she knew. Not that they showed any sign of hostility, but you could never be too careful with wetlanders. A spindly old man with deep-set eyes was sitting at his ease atop one of the chests. What little hair remained to him was white, and his dark face had a kindly look, though a full dozen earrings altogether and a number of thick gold chains around his neck gave his expression a strange twist in her eyes. Like the men above, he was barefoot and bare-chested, but his breeches were a dark blue silk, and his long sash a bright red. An ivory-hilted sword was thrust through that sash, she noted with disdain, as well as 2 curved daggers to match. The slender, handsome woman with her arms folded and a grimly foreboding frown was more worthy of notice. She wore only 4 earrings in each ear, and fewer medallions on her chain than Malin din Toral, and her clothing was all in reddish-yellow silk. She could channel. Avienda knew that, this close. She must be the woman they had come for, the Windfinder. And yet it was another who held Avienda's eye, and for that matter Elaine's and Nynaeve's and Brigitta's. The woman who had looked up from an unrolled map on the table might have been as old as the man by her white hair. Short, no taller than Nynaeve, she looked like someone who had once been stocky and was beginning to go stout, but her jaw thrust forward like a hammer, and her black eyes spoke of intelligence and power. Not the one power, just that of someone who said go and knew that people would go, yet she had it strongly. Her breeches were brocaded green silk, her blouse blue, and her sash red like the man's. The stout bladed knife in a gilded sheath tucked behind that sash had a round pommel covered with red and green stones. Fire drops and emeralds, Avienda thought. Twice as many medallions hung from her nose chain as from Malin din Toral's, and another thinner gold chain connected the 6 rings in each of her ears. Avienda barely kept her hand from going to her own nose again. Without a word, the white-haired woman came to stand in front of Nynaeve, rudely examining her from head to toe, frowning in particular at Nynaeve's face and the great serpent ring on her right hand. She took no time about it, and with a grunt moved on from her ruffled object of study to give Elaine the same quick, intense scrutiny, and then Brigitta. At last she spoke. "You are not an Aes Sedai." Her voice sounded like rocks tumbling. "By the 9 winds and Stormbringer's beard, I am not," Brigitta replied. Sometimes she said things even Elaine and Nynaeve seemed not to understand, but the white-haired woman jumped as if she had been goosed, and stared a long moment before turning to frown up at Avienda. "You are not Aes Sedai either," she grated after the same examination. Avienda drew herself to her full height, feeling as though the woman had rummaged through her garments and twirled her about to look at her better. "I am Avienda, of the 9 Valleys Sept of the Tardad Aiel." The woman gave twice the start she had for Brigitta, black eyes going wide. "You are not garbed as I expected, girl," was all she said, though, and strode back to the far end of the table, where she planted her fists on her hips and studied them all again, much as she might have some strange animal she had never seen before. "I am Nesta den Rie's 2 moons," she said at last. mistress of the ships to the Athaan Mir. How do you know what you know? Nynaeve had been working on a scowl since the woman first looked at her, and now she snapped, Aes Sedai know what they know, and we expect more in the way of manners than I've seen so far. I certainly saw more the last time I was on a seafolk ship. Maybe we should find another, where the people don't all have sore teeth. Nesta Denria's face grew darker, but Elaine, of course, stepped into the breach, removing her cloak and laying it over the edge of the table. The light illumine you and your vessels, shipmistress, and send the winds to speed you all. Her curtsy was moderately deep. Avienda had become a judge of these things. For all she thought it looked the most awkward thing any woman could ever do. Forgive us if there have been words in haste. We mean no disrespect to one who is as a queen to the Athaan Mir. That with a speaking look for Nynaeve. Nynaeve only shrugged, though. Elaine introduced herself again and the rest of them to strange reactions. That Elaine was daughter-heir produced none, though that was a high position among the Wetlanders, and that she was Green Aja and Nynaeve Yellow received sniffs from Nesta Denrias and sharp looks from the spindly old man. Elaine blinked, taken aback, but she went on smoothly. We have come for 2 reasons. The lesser is to ask how you mean to aid the Dragon Reborn, who, according to the Jendai prophecy, you call the Coromor. The greater is to request the help of this vessel's windfinder, whose name, she added gently, I regret I do not yet know. The slender woman who could channel reddened. I am Dorail Din Iron Longfeather, Aes Sedai. I may help if it pleases the light. Malin Din Toral looked abashed, too. The welcome of my ship to you, she murmured, and the grace of the light be upon you until you leave his decks. Not so Nesta Denrias. The bargain is with the Coromor, she said in a hard voice and made a sharp cutting gesture. The shorebound have no part of it, except where they tell of his coming. You, girl, Nynaeve, what ship gave you the gift of passage? Who was his windfinder? I can't recall. Nynaeve's airy tone was at odds with the stony smile she wore. She had a death grip on her braid, too, but at least she had not embraced Saidar again. Flat on the table, Nesta Denrias directed a stare at her that reminded Avienda of Cerilia. Perhaps you are, but I will know who revealed what should not have been revealed. She has lessons of silence to learn.
I don't know.
A split sail is split,
We've always just
Nesta,
broke it
the
up
old
in
man said suddenly,
little
in a
joints
deep
with it.
voice much stronger than his bony limbs suggested. Avienda had taken him for a guard, but his tone was that of an equal. It might be well to ask what aid Aes Sedai would have of us in days when the Coromor has come, and the seas rage in endless storms, and the doom of the prophecy sails the oceans. If they are Aes Sedai. That with a raised eyebrow to the windfinder. She answered quietly in a respectful voice. 3 can channel, including her. She pointed at Avienda. I have never met anyone so strong as they. They must be. Who else would dare wear the ring? Waving her to silence, Nesta Denrias turned that same iron gaze on the man. Aes Sedai never ask aid, Barak, she growled. Aes